Okay, good morning, everybody, and welcome to the 2021 virtual edition of the Royal Tyrrell Museum Speaker Series. My name is Caleb Brown, and I'll be your host today. Today, the Royal Tyrrell Museum and its cooperating society are proud to present Dr. Susannah Maidment, a researcher at the Natural History Museum in London in the UK. For her MSc, Dr. Maidment studied geology at Imperial College London. Following her master's, she completed a PhD at University of Cambridge, where she studied the systematics of the Stegosaurian dinosaurs. After obtaining her degree, she worked as an exploration geologist in Vietnam. Dr. Maidment then returned to academia to work as a postdoctoral researcher at the Natural History Museum, investigating the locomotion of Ornithischian dinosaurs. Following her postdoc, Dr. Maidment took a position as research fellow at Imperial College London, then senior lecturer at Brighton University, and finally a researcher at the Natural History Museum, where she is currently based. Dr. Maidment's research primarily focuses on the systematics, evolution, and paleobiology of Ornithischian dinosaurs, specifically Stegosaurs. Most recently, she's been one of the lead scientists for Mission Jurassic, which is an international collaborative dinosaur excavation project based in the Morrison Formation of Wyoming. Dr. Maidment has received several awards and honors for her research, including the Hudson Award from the Paleontological Association in 2016, the Lyell Fund from the Geological Society of London in 2017, and was featured as one of National Geographic's Women of Impact in 2019. Today, Dr. Maidment will be presenting some of her research on Stegosaurian dinosaurs. So without further delay, I'll hand the mic over to Dr. Susannah Maidment.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Caleb. I'm just going to share my screen with everyone. So hopefully you can see that now. Okay, so I'm going to talk to you today a little bit about the research that I've been doing really over the past 15 years on Stegosaurian dinosaurs. Apologies, my computer is being a little slow. And I can't even blame it being the morning, because here in Sussex, it is the afternoon. Anyway, there we go. Slide one. So the Stegosaurs. The Stegosaurs are a really, I guess they're a really iconic group of dinosaurs. I mean, every 7-year-old in the world knows what Stegosaurus is. I think, and actually, perhaps unexpectedly, there are a whole range of different Stegosaurs out there. So they are known from all around the world, from all the places where they've been found are shown in by these red dots. So they're known from across Europe. There's a couple of species from the UK, across Spain and Portugal, in France. They've also been found in China. There's a few in Africa. I'm going to talk about one of those in a bit more detail later on, and also in North America. And there is probably a stegosaur from Argentina as well. So they're really, really widely distributed. And they are most closely related to ankylosaurs. I don't know whether you can see my cursor when I'm screen sharing, but the middle dinosaur here is an ankylosaur. These are kind of small armoured tank-like animals. They're kind of like walking coffee tables, and they are most closely related to stegosaurs. Now, the ankylosaurs and the stegosaurs kind of have an interesting relationship, because what I'm showing here is along the bottom, I've got millions of years before present, and up the side, I've got the number of genera, so the number of different types that we know. And what you can see is the black line shows sort of stegosaur diversity through time, whereas the grey line shows ankylosaur diversity. And as I say, these two are closely related, and they both must have evolved at some point in the early to early middle Jurassic. And you can see that stegosaurs reach the peak of their diversity at the end of the Jurassic period, and this is when they're most famously known from about 150 million years ago. The ankylosaurs, however, are really rare throughout the Jurassic, and they don't really get going until the Cretaceous. And you can see that grey line kind of shoots up as we go into the Cretaceous. There's a big dip in the middle there, but that's probably just a sampling bias. So it probably just continued to shoot up right the way towards the end of the Cretaceous period, when, of course, all the non-avian dinosaurs went extinct. And this is a kind of classic double wedge curve. So what this suggests is that maybe the ankylosaurs kind of outcompeted stegosaurs going into the Jurassic. And so actually stegosaurs became rare and eventually actually went extinct at the end of the early Cretaceous, potentially because ankylosaurs were kind of better at filling the ecological niche that they both occupied. Now, as I say, stegosaurs are this really, really, really iconic group of dinosaurs, but their fossils are actually surprisingly rare. And this has meant that there's actually really a lot that we don't know about their paleobiology, and it's been really difficult to interpret. And this is kind of an example of some of the problems that we face when we work on stegosaurs. Now, the most famous genus of stegosaur is Stegosaurus. And Stegosaurus, perhaps surprisingly, is only known from about 3 or 4 relatively complete skeletons, and all the rest of the material known from Stegosaurus is really, really, really fragmentary. Now, this is one of those 3 or 4 really complete skeletons. And this and the other three of the others, I should say, except for one, are known as roadkill specimens. And that's hopefully fairly obviously from this picture. It's obvious why they're called that. They kind of look like they've been run over by a bulldozer. So you can see that what we have here over here, I've kind of labelled the parts that I could identify when I was looking at this specimen. We've got the neck, we've got a rib cage here, we've got some plates along the back, we've got a leg bone here, but in the middle there's a whole load of bony mush. And it's really, really, really difficult to kind of tease apart the different bones to understand what they look like, how they might have fitted together. And lots and lots of all of the decent stegosaur specimens that we have really are like this. And that has made it really, really, really difficult to even just understand kind of basic things about their anatomy. Now, that is until in about 2012, the Natural History Museum in London acquired this specimen, which is nicknamed Sophie, and it's the world's most complete Stegosaurus. Sophie is from here. This is a ranch in Wyoming, and the specimen was found where those 4 stakes are in the ground. So the specimen's about 150 million years old, and as I say, it was acquired by the Natural History Museum in 2012, thanks to a large private donation that was given to us so that we could purchase the specimen. The specimen had been excavated on private land in America and was being sold by the people who'd excavated it and prepared it. Now, not only did this donation that allowed us to buy the specimen fund the cost of the specimen and its display and interpretation at the museum, but it also paid for a postdoc who was able to study the specimen for a whole year. So we got a really, really unprecedented opportunity to keep this specimen behind the scenes at the museum, not announce to the public that we had it, but to do loads and loads of work on it before it went on display. So it was really great. It was really a good opportunity for us to learn way more about Stegosaurus than we knew before. And our postdoc, Charlotte, she took over 20,000 photos, individual photos of the specimen, and was able to make this really lovely 3D model as a consequence of those photos. And this is just to show you some details about the sorts of things that we didn't know about stegosaurs that we now know just thanks to this one specimen. So before we had Sophie, we didn't even have a stegosaur with a complete backbone. So we didn't know how many bones there were in its spine. We didn't know how many bones there were in its tail. We didn't know how long the stegosaurs were, basically. We didn't know how long the tail was. We didn't have a stegosaur with a complete array of plates and spines along its back. So we had no idea how many plates or spines or their kind of organization, what that was like at all in Stegosaurus. And also this specimen, I'm going to talk more about this in a bit, has a complete but disarticulated skull. So the skull's made up of loads and loads of different bones. But quite often in these sorts of big ornithischian dinosaurs, all those skull bones kind of fuse together. And this makes it really difficult to interpret the anatomy of the individual bones and kind of understand how the skull works. But in Sophie, now Sophie was actually not fully grown when the animal died. So the skull bones aren't all fused together. So we have a complete but disarticulated skull. And this is the only skull we have of Stegosaurus that's like that. So that was really, really useful. And I'll give you some examples about why that's useful in a bit. So we were given this kind of unprecedented opportunity to study Sophie. So the first thing I obviously did was wrote a really, really long, boring paper about its anatomy. But once we got that over and done with, we wanted to look at body mass. So we wanted to have a look at how much Stegosaurus might have weighed. And there's kind of two ways of doing this in extinct animals. You know, in the press, we often see these kind of reports that a dinosaur weighed X number of tons or whatever. But actually, that's really, really hard to tell for extinct animals because, of course, we don't know anything except their bones. We don't know anything about the flesh. So there's two ways that we can look at body mass. And the first I'm going to call the linear bivariate method, and this is an example of it. So this is a graph which shows living animals, living taxa. And what you can do is you can measure the upper arm bone, the humerus, the circumference of that, and the upper leg bone, the femur, the circumference of that. And if you add them together and you take the log of that measurement, and then you log body mass in living animals, what you find is you get a really nice straight line relationship. And so what we should be able to do is measure the femur and the humerus circumference in Sophie and just plot that on this graph and read off body mass. But there's a couple of potential problems. And that is the largest animal on this graph is an elephant, which is 6 tons. Now, we might speculate that that's larger than Sophie, or perhaps a similar sort of size. But if we were wanting to use this graph to look at a sauropod dinosaur, a long-necked, long-tailed dinosaur, which might be an order of magnitude larger, it might be problematic to extrapolate that data beyond what we have for extant animals. But perhaps more worryingly, the largest reptile we have in this data set is an alligator at 170 kilos, which is going to be substantially smaller than our dinosaurs. So there's maybe some reasons to be a bit worried about this, or at least that we might want to check that our results are right. So there's a second method, and this is called what I'm going to call the volumetric method. And in this method, we can take a lovely complete skeleton like we have for this specimen. We take a digital model of it, which we have, and you kind of shrink wrap it in a series of convex hulls. So these are like shapes that you shrink wrap around the skeleton and around different portions of the skeleton, as is shown here in blue. And then what you can do is you can apply the density of living tissues to those body volumes. And you can also do things like take out the lung volume from that and stuff like that. Now, of course, that just gives you a real minimum estimate of the kind of volume of the skeleton. And once we've got volume and we've got density, of course, we can work out mass. But it gives us a very, very minimal kind of estimate. So when you look at living animals, and you do this on living animals, what you find is, the body mass is much lower. But if you increase those volumes by about 21%, then what you end up with is a really good estimate of the body mass of living animals. So this is one way that we could look at trying to get an estimate for dinosaur body mass as well. Now, of course, the drawback of this method is that you need a beautiful, complete articulated skeleton to be able to do this. And in this case, we actually have one, but that is very rare. Now, so when we did this, we used this volumetric method to look at the mass of Sophie. And when we did this, we found that Sophie, plus that 21% kind of account for the fleshiness of living animals type addition, weighed about 1.5 tons. So that's about the same as a white rhino. Also, the great thing about being able to do things on the computer and being able to do things digitally is that we can do some sensitivity analyses. So we might speculate that dinosaurs were maybe abnormally fleshy relative to other animals or animals that are alive today. So we might say, okay, well, what if we increase that body mass by 50%, or those volumes, by 50%, and then calculated body mass? And that gives us a body mass of 1.9 tons. So it actually doesn't really change massively the body mass estimates that we're getting here to, it allows us to kind of have some confidence in the body mass estimates that we are doing. Now, we also calculated Sophie's body mass using the linear bivariate method. And we came out with a body mass of 3.8 tons. So that's almost double what our volumetric body mass had given us. So just for fun, we thought we'd reconstruct a convex hull around the skeleton to have a look at what the specimen looked like, or would have looked like if it weighed 3.8 tons. And this is it. And as I think you'll probably agree that this is sort of an unrealistically chubby animal. It's got its flesh is really quite a long way away from its bones, and its belly is kind of dragging down by its knees. So we think this is probably unrealistically fleshy. So there's something weird going on here. And the answer, of course, when we started looking at this, is that Sophie was not fully grown when it died. And I'm saying it because we call it Sophie, but we can't actually tell whether it's female or male. So these are the different, along the bottom of this rather messy figure, all different ways of estimating body mass. And up the side are the estimated mass that we have. And the blue box that I've drawn on here is showing you what our kind of best guess for the body mass of Sophie was. So we have between something like 1.5 and 2.2 tons or something like that. And what we find is that 3.8%, that 3.8 ton body mass that was estimated by the linear method, I've actually labelled that somewhat politically incorrectly as fat Sophie here. So sorry about that anyway. That, as you can see, is well outside of kind of the range of our error margin on our body mass, on what we believe is a more reliable body mass estimate. But somebody really smart has developed a really clever technique to take into account the fact that Sophie wasn't fully grown when the specimen died. And that linear bivariate method requires the animals to be adults and requires them to be fully grown. And when we were able to apply that correction to the linear bivariate method, it actually brought our body mass estimates. So that's what's highlighted in this red circle at the end here, back down into our error margin. So we're really happy that Sophie weighed about the same as a rhino. That was a really long-winded way of saying that Sophie weighs about the same as a rhino. Anyway, another thing that we can do is we can look with these kind of cool digital models and computational techniques, is we can look at body mass and the distribution of body mass and centres of mass. And so this is actually some work that I did with Don Henderson at the Royal Tyrrell Museum. And we looked at the centre of mass of stegosaurs. And one of the things that I was kind of interested in was there's been this idea in the literature for a while that stegosaurs could rear up onto their hind limbs to adopt this posture that I've shown here that's called the tripodal stance. And the idea with that is that maybe they could feed in sort of with higher branches. They've got very short forelimbs, stegosaurs, so their heads must have always been quite close to the ground. So maybe if they reared up, they would have been able to feed higher up in the branches. What we showed we were able to calculate the centre of mass of Sophie, and what we found was that the body mass actually lay right over the hips, and it was where this small black cross is here. And that's actually kind of further back than in many other dinosaurs for which we've calculated the centre of mass. So I think that lends some support to this idea that potentially stegosaurs could adopt this pose. We don't know that they did, but I think it lends some support to the idea that they might have been able to. Okay, I talked a little bit earlier about this amazing disarticulated 3D complete skull we have with Sophie. And we were able to CT scan this skull. And my colleagues at the University of Birmingham and at the NHM were then able to reconstruct it to produce this beautiful model. And they applied a technique called finite element analysis to examine how the stress distribution in the skull might have, how the stress might have been distributed in the skull during feeding and the sort of food that stegosaurs might have eaten. Now, stegosaurs have really, really teeny tiny teeth. Their crowns, their tooth crowns, are only about 0.5 centimetre in size. And these are pretty big animals, as I just say. They're like the size of a rhino, but they've got these teeny tiny teeth. And I always kind of thought that suggested that they were just slurping kind of really soft vegetation. There's not a lot of evidence that they were doing a lot of chewing or processing of food in their mouth. And that's quite unusual in the ornithischian dinosaurs. A lot of these sorts of dinosaurs, like the ankylosaurs, the ceratopsians, we actually see them. We see evidence in their teeth that they're actually chewing, but we're not really seeing that in stegosaurs at all. So I thought these things must have just been slurping, kind of something really soft, not really chewing it. But actually, this is an engineering method that they applied to look at stress distributions. And what they found was that actually stegosaurs could probably had quite a strong bite. And actually, they could probably crunch through small twigs and things like that. And they probably had a bite force actually quite similar to sheep today. This is a bit of a surprise to me. But of course, we think that a lot of these sorts of ornithischian dinosaurs had a kind of horny beak. And obviously, that's not preserved in their fossils. But potentially, this bite force was being transmitted through that horny beak rather than through the teeth. So it turns out that stegosaurs weren't quite as rubbish at eating as I thought they might have been. Another thing that I'm really interested in is locomotion and how these sorts of dinosaurs and the stegosaurs included might have moved. And what could they have run? Could they have run away from predators and that sort of thing? So I had a look at initially in this part of my research was very, very qualitative. I wanted to look at the leg muscles of stegosaurs and try to understand a little bit how they differed from their two-legged relatives. So all of the ornithischian dinosaurs evolved from two-legged ancestors, and obviously stegosaurs and ankylosaurs became four-legged. So I wanted to understand a little bit about the muscles and the soft tissues first. Now, in order to do that, we need to look at the closest living relatives of the dinosaurs, and that is the crocodiles and the birds. So I did some dissections. I was lucky enough to be invited to the Royal Vet College in London and get to join some of John Hutchinson's dissections, which is great because, as Caleb said at the beginning, I'm a geologist, so living stuff is just way outside my experience. And then I also got brave and bought some chickens from the supermarket and dissected some of those as well. If you buy them from the supermarket, you don't have to deal with the blood and guts, which is always nice. I reconstructed a load of the leg muscles on stegosaurs. And this enabled me to kind of draw some lines of action to think about how the muscles might have worked and what the implications were for how they might have stood. So the big picture in the middle here is supposed to be a hip of a stegosaur, so the front of the animals to the front, to the left, and the back of the animals to the right. And the grey lines are some of the muscles and the lines of action that I was interested in. And what I was able to show from this was that this is how stegosaurs would have stood. So I'm not much of a paleo artist. So these stick and ball figures are my reconstructions of it. This one here is a kind of front-on view of a stegosaur and its forelimbs, how its forelimbs would have stood. And you can see that it has its elbows held out to the side somewhat and it's slightly bent. Now its hind limbs, in contrast, which is shown here in B, are much straighter. And you can see this is a side view in C here. So you can see its hind limbs are much straighter, whereas its forelimbs are really, really bent. And also, of course, we have trackways from animals that we think may well have been stegosaurs. So we can kind of prove these ideas against the fossil record. And that seems to kind of support the ideas that I had around this. But one of the things that comes out of this is that stegosaurs must have had a really, really, really short stride. And it would have been limited by this bent forelimb. So they couldn't have brought their humerus, their forelimb forward beyond vertical. And this would have really limited their stride length. And of course, that means that they just wouldn't have been able to move very fast. Now, this was, as I say, very qualitative work. So we wanted to do something a little bit more quantitative around this. So we built some biomechanical models. Now, this is actually not a stegosaur, and I'm showing you it because it's the only video I've got of this. This is actually a small ornithischian dinosaur called Lesothosaurus. But this is the hip bones again, and actually the front of the animals to the right in this image and the back of the animals to the left. And what you can see is we're able to plot on all of these muscles and then make the leg swing. And what we can do is we can measure the change in the length of the muscles and the change in the angle of the muscles. And this allows us to calculate the moment arm of the muscle, which is effectively a measure of the torque on the muscle, the ability of the muscle to pull the leg in different directions. And this gives us a good idea of what kind of locomotor performance of what the animals might have been able to do. And we were able to do this across a whole range of different dinosaurs to try to compare across those. Now, the problem with this is that moment arms aren't the only story when it comes to muscles. We also need to know the size of the muscles and fiber types and things like that. And unfortunately, in the fossil record, we just don't have that information. So we're trying to build on this research at the moment. And what we want to do is make something like this. So this is a similar model, but made from obviously a TRex, obviously, because everyone loves TRex for some reason. And this is an evolutionary robotic model. So what my colleagues at the universities of Liverpool and Manchester did here was they did a similar biomechanical model, and they put this lovely model into a evolutionary learning algorithm, and they told it to basically learn to walk. And of course, the first thing that it does is it like boings and bounces and it falls over, and then it knows that it can't do that. So next time it tries a different way of walking. And the really cool thing about these models is that you can put in all sorts of physical constraints. So obviously you tell the model that it has to obey gravity, but you also can do things like you can put strength constraints on the bones. So you can say, if the bone becomes particularly stressed or a higher stress than a particular threshold level, then that's not going to work. And what the researchers were able to show with this core model is that T-Rex actually couldn't run. Its bones would literally have broken if it tried to do a running gait. And I have a PhD student at the moment who is working on a similar sort of thing for the four-legged dinosaurs, the ornithischian dinosaurs. So I hope that one day we're going to have a model like this for stegosaurs, and we're going to be able to test some of my ideas about them being really, really slow moving and kind of shuffling along. But I have to tell you about that at some point in the future, because I don't know the result yet. Okay, so stegosaurs. Probably the most obvious thing about stegosaurs when when we see them like this is that they have these array of plates and spines that extend down their backs. And the question that I am asked most commonly as a stegosaur researcher is, well, what was the function of these plates and spines? And that's a really, really good question, and it's one that's really difficult to answer. These are a whole range of different stegosaurs. In the top left here, we've got Spinosaurus from China. I don't know why it's sitting in that position. It looks like it might be laying an egg or something. I don't know. Anyway, it's weird. That's mounted in the Zhejiang Dinosaur Museum. I've shown you Sophie before in the top right there. The bottom left, that's another Chinese stegosaur called Huayangosaurus. And in the bottom right, that's a Portuguese stegosaur called Miragaia. And what you can see, I hope, from these pictures is that all of the stegosaurs have quite differently shaped plates and spines. Most obviously, Stegosaurus has these very, very big, broad, flat plates, and they seem to have been arranged kind of offset from each other. Whereas in the other stegosaurs, we actually find that the plates were arranged as pairs down the back. And they're much, much smaller than they are in Stegosaurus. And they're also not as plate-like. They're not as big and flat. They're much more kind of triangular and maybe a bit fatter. And in Miragaia here, and also in Spinosaurus, you can see that they also have these very, very big spines that come out of their shoulder, and we don't have those in Stegosaurus. In Miragaia also, we have some lovely paired plates, so we can see really, really clearly that the plates were actually paired down their necks. So a number of different ideas have been suggested in the past about why, what the function of the Stegosaurus plates might have been. One that's kind of commonly been suggested that I've tried to show here using this illustration on the left with the red flushed plates is this idea that they could have been used as heat radiators. Now, ornithischian dinosaurs were cold-blooded dinosaurs, or at least had a more cold-blooded metabolism, but they were very, very, very large. So actually, their biggest problem, unlike kind of something like a lizard today, is rather than having to waddle out and wait for the sun to heat them up enough to become active, but have actually been losing their metabolic heat. So they're generating heat all the time by moving around and eating and all the processes that are going on inside their bodies, but they've got to lose that heat somehow. So it's been suggested that the plates of Stegosaurus could have been used as heat radiators, and that maybe they pumped blood into their plates, and this allowed the heat from that blood to radiate out. And some people have done some thermodynamics around that and kind of calculated that the surface area to volume ratio of the plates was capable of doing that, so that would have worked. Now, I don't think, whilst I think that might have been the case in Stegosaurus, I don't think that's the reason that the plates evolved. And I think that's true because, as I've showed you, other Stegosaurs didn't have these very broad flat plates. And some of them had very spine-like plates. And while they would have had some thermal capabilities, I'm not sure that would have been the same as those of Stegosaurus. So I don't think that's the reason that they evolved in the first place. Another thing that has been suggested, an idea that has been suggested for the function of the plates, is that they were dermal armor. So they're actually armor that are protecting the backs of these animals. And of course, we know that the sister group to Stegosaurs, the Ankylosaurs, they're absolutely covered in this armor plating. But Stegosaurs aren't. They've only got this armor down their back, right down the middle of their spine, and their flanks are entirely exposed. And also, the plates of Stegosaurs are really thin, particularly Stegosaurus, are really, really thin. So in this picture here on the right, I've got, this is in the Denver Museum of Nature and Science, we've got Allosaurus attacking Stegosaurus. And I think if you had a bone-crunching bite force like Allosaurus, biting through a stegosaur plate would probably be like eating a pack of Doritos or something like that. I don't think it would be a massive challenge for you as a predator to these plates. Would, they wouldn't have put you off that much. So I suspect that they're not actually armor either. However, it's possible that they were used in some sort of defensive way, perhaps as display, like to make the animal look bigger than it was, or to make it look more scary. Again, people have suggested that maybe they flushed their plates red in some sort of display. So it's possible that the plates were being used in some sort of display function, and I actually think that's quite compelling, because as I showed you earlier, and hopefully this slide will also demonstrate, all the different species of stegosaurs have different shaped plates. So I've got 5 different species of stegosaur here, and you can see that some of them have these broad flat plates, like this one, Stegosaurus up here. I haven't got a scale bar on that image, but that plate is about 1 meter in size. It's a huge thing. This one in the middle is from a British stegosaur called Loricatosaurus. And then we've got Chungkingosaurus, Huayangosaurus, and Miragaya here. So all of these plates are very slightly different in shape. And I think that could be suggestive that they were being used maybe in intraspecific recognition. So they're trying to recognize members of the same species or something like that. We have some evidence that lots of these stegosaurs might have been living alongside each other in the same ecosystems. But the problem is, going back to what I said originally, is that these ideas are really, really, really difficult to test. And I have yet to come up with a way in which we can kind of quantitatively examine any of these ideas. So I think the function of stegosaur plates is still an open question. Okay, so I talked a little bit about stegosaur paleobiology. I thought I'd talk a little bit more now about 2 particular species, or several particular species, and some interesting things, or I think they're interesting things that we know about them, or we found out about them. So in North America, there are actually 2 species of stegosaurs. There's Stegosaurus, which is obviously everybody's favorite dinosaur, and we know it really well. It's known, as I say, from lots and lots and lots of fragmentary material. 3 or 4 pretty good skeletons, including that one at the top, and Sophie, which I've already talked about. And this lovely skull down here is another complete skull, but that's the one that's all fused together. And then we have this other species, which is much less well known. It's called Hesperosaurus. And it's actually, at the moment, it is known from a number of specimens, but almost all of them, except for one, are in a private museum, which means that we haven't really been able to study them to know much about them. So this beautiful specimen that I've got a photo of down here in the bottom right, it's actually, hopefully you can make out what it is. You've got a forearm here, and then you've got the rib cage, and then this is the pelvis, and it's all articulated. There's actually, they've also got the skull of this specimen as well, but that's in a private museum. And so, I mean, I went and had a look at it, but I can't really say anything about it. It's a bit frustrating. So we don't really know much about Hesperosaurus at all. Now, both of these dinosaurs are from the Upper Jurassic Morrison Formation of the Western USA. So this is a suite of rocks that were deposited by rivers and on floodplains about 150 million years ago. And they extend over a massive area from Montana in the north right down to New Mexico in the south. So this is about 12 degrees of latitude, and their outcrop covers about 1.2 million square kilometers. As you can see from this photo, it's also one of my favorite places. And yeah, here's the blue on this map, just shows you the whole outcrop. You can see up here, basically the top of this map is pretty much the Canadian border, and down here in New Mexico, so we're almost at the Mexican border as well. So basically this outcrop is absolutely vast, this basin that Stegosaurus and Hesperosaurus lived in. And of course they lived alongside everyone's favorite, all the dinosaurs that you could name when you were 6, so Diplodocus and Brontosaurus and all of those. Now, when we plot the ranges of Hesperosaurus and Stegosaurus on a map, what we find is that Stegosaurus appears to be restricted to the southern half of the Morrison Basin. The most northerly occurrence of Stegosaurus we have is actually Sophie up here in the Bighorn Basin of Wyoming, whereas Hesperosaurus is pretty much only known from Montana, with a couple of specimens coming from the same area or similar area to Sophie. So there's hardly any range overlap between these 2 taxa at all. And I think that's kind of interesting. They were definitely living at the same time, but they don't seem to have overlapped. Now, it's possible that this is a sampling bias. So the fossil record doesn't preserve a faithful chronicle of past life, but is biased by a whole range of different things that range from how we find fossils as paleontologists to different types of rock which preserve fossils better. However, the Morrison Formation is probably the most densely sampled upper Jurassic ecosystem on Earth, terrestrial ecosystem, I should say, on Earth. So people have been looking for dinosaurs in the Morrison Formation for well over around about 150 years. And particularly down in southern Wyoming and Utah, that is really intensively sampled for dinosaurs. And there's never been a single specimen of Hesperosaurus found down there. Now, up there in Montana, research into the Morrison is only just beginning. So it's possible that we might find Stegosaurus up there in the future. But based upon this kind of current picture of raw data, it looks like the ranges of these two animals weren't overlapping. And I think that's really interesting. Hesperosaurus is actually quite small compared to Stegosaurus. Stegosaurus is one of the biggest stegosaurs that we know. And in living animals, among extant mega herbivores, large size has actually been interpreted, or has occasionally been interpreted, as an adaptation for aridity, so for arid environments. So I am going to wildly speculate that maybe the reason that we have Stegosaurus, this very big animal, down in the south, whereas we have Hesperosaurus in the north, might be because they're actually segregated along climatic or ecological lines, where we've got a cooler climate in the north, and we've got this smaller taxon living in a warmer, hotter climate in the south, where we've got this larger taxon living. And we do actually have a lot of sedimentological evidence to suggest that the Morrison Basin was very arid in the south, but it wasn't in the north. It was much wetter in the north. Okay, so the most recent news in the world of stegosaurs, it comes kind of slowly, news in the world of stegosaurs, I have to say. But anyway, it was last year, 2 years ago, can't remember, where are we? 2 years ago, we announced the discovery of this taxon, a new stegosaur called Adriaticlet bulhapa. And it is from the Middle Atlas Mountains of Morocco. And it's actually the earliest confirmed stegosaur. There's kind of tentative remains that are a bit earlier, but we don't know much about those at the moment. So this is kind of the earliest definitive stegosaur. And it's the first from North Africa. And it's found in this area, in this photo here. It's really a nice place to work. The specimen that we have at the moment is really, really fragmentary. This is much of it, to be honest with you. So these are some forelimbs and some vertebrae, and a potentially interesting spike down here. I was hoping to be able to talk more about this. I was supposed to go back to this site last summer and do a whole load more work there. I'm working with a Moroccan colleague, and he was able to get out to the site, but he just did some sedimentology. He's a sedimentologist, so he didn't excavate anything. But yeah, unfortunately, we weren't able to get out there. I don't think I'm going to get out there this summer either. So we'll have to hold fire on revealing any more information, because I don't know any more information about it yet. But anyway, that is the most recent taxon that we've discovered, and it's really exciting to have one in North Africa. And our study on it so far suggests that it's actually more closely related to the European stegosaurs than it is to the other African stegosaurs. Okay, thank you so much for listening to my talk. Thank you so much for inviting me as well. It's a real pleasure to talk to you guys. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Okay, thank you very much for that, Dr. Maidment. There's already a few questions lined up in the question and answer. If you do have questions at home, please do ask that at the question and answer area below. Before we delve into those, though, I'm just going to remind everyone, don't forget to join us next week when Dr. Michelle Stoker from Virginia Polytechnic Institute and State University will present on Life After Death, Evolutionary Experimentation in the Aftermath of the Permo-Triassic Mass Extinction. Sounds like an exciting talk. Okay, so there were a lot of questions that came in early, and some of these you answered in your talk, and people have noticed that. So I'll probably just not go through those so you don't have to repeat yourself. One of the questions from Graham is, you mentioned that stegosaur fossils have not been found on Antarctica. Have paleontologists looked for their bones there?
That's a good question. Yeah, actually, there are dinosaurs known from Antarctica. There is an ankylosaur from Antarctica, which is called Antarctopelta. And actually, I have on my desk right now an undescribed ornithopod from Antarctica, which we're working on at the moment. So dinosaurs have been found in Antarctica, and also a load of marine reptiles as well, but not stegosaurs to date.
Sounds good. Another question from Graham. On most of the Stegosaurus toys that they have at home, the plates look very ridged or veiny. Is this how they would have looked in real life?
Yeah, that's a good question, actually. Yeah, that's probably quite accurate, actually, because the bones, or at least it's accurate in terms of their fossils, because the plates are made up of a bony core, and they almost certainly had some sort of kind of keratinous sheath over the top of that. So keratin is a protein that's similar to what your fingernails are made of, or kind of rhino horn or something like that. So if you can imagine that they would have had an extra layer that we don't see in the bones. And in order for that layer to grow and to develop, it needed a really good blood supply. And so actually all across the plates, we see these kind of blood vessel pits and tubes and channels, which indicate this blood supply. So yeah, those sorts of ridges on the fossils are probably quite accurate in terms of what we see on the bones.
Good. Destiny asks, since we know that stegosaurs and ankylosaurs are very closely related, are there any known suspected bridging specimens as one population declines and the other appears to increase? Is there any transition between them?
So I think that question is asking, what was the common ancestor of stegosaurs and ankylosaurs like?
Yeah, I think they're asking, are stegosaurs evolving into ankylosaurs, or are they more distantly related? How does that? Yeah.
So the way that we understand evolutionary relations, the way we work out and we calculate evolutionary relationships, is we never really find ancestors or one evolving into another. We always think of them as a series of kind of they're more closely related to each other, because if you think about the length of time that we're talking and the accuracy of the fossil record, it's really very difficult, perhaps everywhere except for the Dinosaur Park Formation, just where you guys are in Drumheller, to actually see the relationships of one animal evolving into another. So it's really, really difficult. But what we think is that stegosaurs and ankylosaurs would have shared a common ancestor. We haven't found that common ancestor, but we do have some animals that we think might be quite close to that common ancestor, or quite similar to that common ancestor. There's one called Scelidosaurus. It's actually from the lower Jurassic, so about 200 million years ago, 190 million years ago, 196 million years ago, something like that. And it's from the UK, and it's got quite a lot of armor like ankylosaurs, but it's much more slender. It still bears the hallmarks of some of its bipedal ancestors. So it was probably four-legged, but there's some aspects of its anatomy that look like its two-legged ancestors. And it's got less armor on its head and parts of its body than ankylosaurs do. So what it seems like is that stegosaurs must have lost quite a lot of that body armor, whereas ankylosaurs maybe develop more of it from relative to their common ancestor. I hope that answers that question.
I think that's a pretty good answer. We have a question from Aman, who asks, what type of teeth did they have, and how many teeth did they have in their mouths?
How many teeth? Oh goodness, I don't know how many teeth they had in their mouths off the top of my head, actually. I around 20 in the upper jaw, I think. For Stegosaurus. For the other stegosaurs, actually we only have two stegosaurs in which we have complete skulls, and that's Stegosaurus and Hawaiianosaurus. Oh, and Hesperosaurus, of course, we have Hesperosaurus as well. So around 20, 25, something like that. They're very simple, just triangular kind of leaf-shaped teeth. They have little tiny denticles on. They're basically what we think of as kind of classic herbivore teeth. But they're very, very simple compared to a lot of the ornithischian dinosaurs, which have big dental batteries. So they have multiple rows of these teeth. As I say, they have wear facets to show how these teeth are kind of grinding together. We don't see that in the stegosaurs at all. So they're quite simple and very small.
Priyanshu has two questions. First, do they have a gizzard for a digestive system? And secondly, were these social animals? Did they live in herds or groups?
Unfortunately, I'm going to say we don't know for both of those. So in terms of the gizzard, we would need to be finding a skeleton in which we could find all the stomach stones. Excuse me. And we haven't got any of those yet. As I said, these animals, they're really surprisingly rare as fossils, and most of them, we have nothing even remotely close to a complete skeleton. I just showed you the adriticlate skeleton, which is, it's just a few bones. So to be able to find something that was articulated with stomach stones would be fabulous, but as yet we haven't. And likewise, we don't really know anything about their social behaviour. We have no nests, we have no eggs, we have no babies. There is a very small individual of Stegosaurus, but we really have nothing approaching a hatchling or anything like that. So we really know very little about their lifestyle. There is one site where multiple specimens, I think 4 specimens of Hesperosaurus have been found together, but it's not totally clear that just because we find them together that they live together. They could have been, all those bones could have been washed together in a flood or something like that. So at the moment, we don't know the answer to that.
Okay. Sarah has a question that I think you will sympathize with. I've listened to paleontology lectures almost daily for a year now, and this is the first one about Stegosaurs. Do you think this is because of the paucity of specimens?
It's because of the paucity of specimens and also the paucity of people who work on them. I think it's fair to say, Caleb, would you agree that I'm basically the only person in the world who works on Stegosaurs right now? So yeah,
you're certainly the person that comes to mind when I think of the group. Yeah.
So yeah, sorry, it's a shame, isn't it? Because they're so famous as fossils. Yeah, nobody really works on them. It's a lonely world.
Michael asks, I've heard that stegosaur bodies were flexible and agile, and that they could have curled themselves into a U shape to direct the spines and the tail spikes outward. What is your assessment of this idea? I think it's unlikely that they were any more flexible than any other dinosaur. I have never seen any evidence in their spinal column which would suggest that they could curl up particularly. To assess that, what I'd want to do is go and look at living vertebrates that display that kind of behavior, see whether they have any kind of unique adaptations in their vertebrae that would allow them to do that, or would indicate to us that they did that behavior, and then see. I have to say, I've never looked at that. I've never thought that, but I don't think off the top of my head there's anything particularly unusual about stegosaur vertebrae that would suggest that they could do that. So I'm going to say I doubt it, but I don't know. Maximilian asks, does the presence of stegosaur fossils in Argentina signify that the group may have diversified earlier than previously anticipated, and having to do with the separation of Laurasia and Gondwana?
Yeah, so the stegosaur, the putative stegosaur from Argentina is called Sora, and when this specimen is from the earliest middle Jurassic. So that indicates that if it is a stegosaur, that stegosaurs and ankylosaurs had already diverged by that time, which probably means that they split sometime in the early Jurassic, which is really interesting because the earliest ornithischians we have in the fossil record are also from the early Jurassic. So this indicates that we have like this major radiation of these armoured dinosaurs very shortly after the first ornithischians. Yeah, Sora though, I haven't seen the specimen. It's only been described in the literature. It was originally described in the literature as not being a thyrophorus, or not being an armoured dinosaur at all. It was actually being just a different ornithischian dinosaur. And there were several people who reviewed the paper, including me, who said, pretty sure this is a stegosaur. But the authors were unable to reconstruct it as such when they were working out their family trees. Now, subsequently, when we put the animal into our family trees, we do get it as a stegosaur, but then our family trees only really focus on armoured dinosaurs. They don't focus on anything else. So it doesn't really give it the opportunity not to be an armoured dinosaur. So it hasn't really been tested yet. But also, they've only described the skull. So we haven't got a description yet of the rest of the animal. And that would be that's kind of quite critical, I would say, to help us tell what sort of animal it is. But yes, it would suggest that stegosaurs and ankylosaurs diverged very early, much earlier than perhaps we thought before.
Okay. A question from one of our staff. Dan asks, is Stegosaurus armatus a valid species or not?
It's not. So Stegosaurus armatus was the holotype of the genus Stegosaurus, and but the holotype specimen was actually indeterminate. It was just a few vertebrae. What happened apparently when they excavated the skeleton, so I've read, was that they excavated a lot of these early Morrison quarries with dynamite. So they just blasted the rock apart, shattering lots of the skeletons. And so basically the holotype specimen was a load of rubble and maybe a vertebra. And so, but it was the holder of the name Stegosaurus. And so we kind of were faced with two choices, that we either make Stegosaurus a nomen dubium and, just get rid of the whole taxon and come up with a new name for all these fabulous Morrison dinosaurs, or we write to the ICZN and ask them to change the holotype. And so that happened in 2011. So the holotype of Stegosaurus is now Stegosaurus stenops, or so Stegosaurus armatus is a nomen dubium.
Ryan noticed that in one of the photos you had a picture with osteoderms under the neck of the animal. Can you talk about those quickly?
Yeah, they've been only described in Stegosaurus. And there's only a few specimens that have been preserved, and that's one, and it's that specimen from Denver. They're a bit enigmatic, to be honest. They're not, as I say, all these flipping skeletons are so fragmentary that it's really difficult to know, whether absence of evidence, evidence of that. What do I mean? Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Have I got that the right way around? Yeah. So just because we don't find them with the skeletons doesn't mean they didn't have them. But yeah, it does appear that certainly some individuals of Stegosaurus had some sort of chainmail under their necks.
Elizabeth is wondering what pose Stegosaurs would have adopted when they lie down. Do we have any idea of how they did that?
Not really. I mean, I don't think we have a good idea of that for many dinosaurs, really, do we? I don't know. I mean, I reckon. I'm completely speculating. I have absolutely no basis on how to answer that. But I reckon that they probably would have laid down kind of like, when horses kind of like half sit down and half sit up. I don't think they would have been lying down on their backs particularly because of those plates. They got stuck in the ground. But yeah, no, we don't know. I don't know.
Okay. Andrew asks, do we have a good idea for the evolution of the shoulder spikes in certain Stegosaurs, and what advantage would these have been?
Yeah, they are actually, most Stegosaurs seem to have them. And actually Stegosaurus and Hesperosaurus seem like the weirdos for not having them. And actually Stegosaurus and Hesperosaurus are probably the two that we have good enough skeletons of to be pretty sure that they were genuinely absent, and it's not just that we haven't found them yet. And so if forced to speculate, I would say that probably that most Stegosaurs did have shoulder spines. They were probably developed originally from these sorts of scutes that things like ankylosaurs have in their skins, and then they kind of hypertrophied like stegosaur plates did. Whether their function was for display or whether it was for genuine protection, I don't know. But I'm generally of the opinion that these things are probably display structures.
Okay, I must say that this is the most questions I think we've ever got for a talk. So we're going to keep going. I don't know how much time you have available. If you can keep going, or okay.
No, whatever. No, it's evening.
Okay. Dan asks, with the center of gravity over the hips and the small forelimbs, are there any features of Stegosaurus that would limit them from being facultatively bipedal?
I would say yes. They have their hands are very, very robust. They've got hoof-shaped manual ungles. They're very clearly designed for weight bearing. Their forelimbs also scale. If you look at the kind of scaling relationships between the forelimbs, they scale along with other quadrupedal animals. They don't look bipedal at all. And yeah, I think that the anatomy of their wrists. Also, their palms had to face downwards, so they were typers, not clappers. Most of the two-legged dinosaurs we know are clappers, and of course, at some point that they had to evolve to be weight-bearing, but Stegosaurs most certainly were. Yeah, I don't think there's any evidence whatsoever to suggest that they were bipedal.
Okay. Andrew and Barbara both ask about Alkavasaurus, and what is your thoughts on the validity of that taxon?
Yeah, so Alkavasaurus is based on a specimen that used to be called Stegosaurus longispinus. And Stegosaurus longispinus was known from some vertebrae, a femur, and some really, really, as the name suggests, ridiculously long spines. And it was housed in the University of Wyoming Museum, which suffered a devastating flood in the 1930s, and the specimen was destroyed. And all that remains of that specimen is a cast of one of the spikes, I think, or maybe a partial cast, and nothing else. Now, there are a load of photos and some records of the specimen being excavated, and also people described it at the time. And recently, it's been suggested, based on those descriptions and photographs, that this is actually a valid taxon. It's not a Stegosaurus. It's actually a new species in the Morrison Formation. I didn't talk about it being in the Morrison Formation, but it has been suggested. I just think it's really hard to say. I'm not a massive fan of naming things based on fossils that don't exist anymore. But it does seem to, I find that the arguments for it being a separate species, I guess, not uncompelling. The jury's out. I'd like to find another one and be like, oh yeah, you're absolutely right. This is, I really, really see this feature. It's completely different, as opposed to just, a really big Stegosaurus.
Okay, we have a question from Tut, who's asking that Stegosaurs seem to be rare relative to their contemporaneous sauropods. Do you think this is a real ecological signal, or is it a sampling bias? What are your thoughts on the paleoecology there?
Yeah, I mean, it's probably a bit of both, actually, I think. I suspect there is a large dollop of sampling bias going on. I mean, sauropods are massive. So, their bones are generally really big, particularly their limb bones and their vertebrae. If you, however, look at, so in the Morrison Formation, the vast majority of the sort of herbivorous dinosaurs, at least that we find, are sauropods. If you look at how many skulls we have, though, and sauropod skulls are very, very fragile, there's something ridiculous like only 24. So there's hardly any skulls of sauropods. But we know that there was tons of sauropods out there because their leg bones are everywhere. So I think that there is a big sampling bias going on, and also remember, and I think this is something that we often forget, is that these animals are really, really old relative to some other dinosaurs. So the ceratopsids that you guys find in Dinosaur Provincial Park and the hadrosaurs, stegosaurs were already fossils by the time those things were mooching about in Canada. So we're going back a really, really long time ago, and loads of stuff can happen to fossils in that time. So I think it would be very naive to say that there's not some sampling biases going on, and I'm certain that the Stegosaur fossil record is heavily biased by its size relative to sauropods. However, I do think that it remains possible that stegosaurs might just have lived in slightly different environments, or just environments that maybe preserve a little bit less well in the fossil record, just because in other places they're very rare as well. They just seem to be quite a rare component of ecosystems in the Middle Jurassic. So I suspect there's a bit of both.
Yeah, sounds good. Cameron asks about the difference between juvenile and adult stegosaurs. Do we know much about how they changed through their life?
Yeah, good question. No, not really. I mean, I said earlier we don't have any nests, we don't have any babies, we don't have any hatchlings. There's one pretty small specimen that is from Dinosaur National Monument, and it's some limb bones, and it's got a little teeny tiny plate. So we know that the babies had plates, but that's it, really. It's just some limbs and a plate. So, and other than that, then we're getting into, the next sort of smallest are things like Sophie, which is actually, was probably a sexually mature adult when it died. It just hadn't quite finished growing yet. So yeah, no, not really.
Okay. Daryl says that he's seen two very different looking skulls for Stegosaurus. You have one that's very long and thin, and one that's squatter. I guess what's the deal with this? Is this one being reconstructed or?
Yeah, I showed you a picture earlier of a very lovely skull that was all fused together. And it was the actual fossil rather than the reconstructions. And that is from the holotype, what is now the holotype of Stegosaurus. And when it was originally reconstructed and figured, it was figured in a monograph by a chap called Charles Gilmore in 1914. And it used a load of plates that had been commissioned by Marsh, as in Cope and Marsh, Dinosaur Wars Marsh. And the thing with those figures and those plates is that whoever drew them wasn't really great about kind of highlighting where they were just sort of like reconstructing things as opposed to like faithfully drawing the fossil. And so I was really surprised when I saw that fossil for the first time, because I'd been looking at, Marsh's plates all the way through my PhD, and then I get to see it and it's all squashed. Like the nose is all squashed down. And so I think that actually Stegosaurus didn't have this very kind of long, low, blocky skull. It actually had that much more kind of gently sloping nose, like we reconstructed for Sophie, based on Sophie's skull and beautiful disarticulated skull that we have. And actually, like everybody's view of the preceding 100 years had been based on this completely kind of squashed fossil that had been kind of somewhat reconstructed in a generous way in a monograph.
Melissa Kim starts off by saying, you make paleontology seem really fun. So,
thanks.
And then she asks, why don't private museums allow specimens to study allow scientists to study their specimens? There's a bit of a nuance there, but I'll let you. And then the second one, paleontology appears to be a male-dominant field. Are you finding that more female scientists are choosing paleontology as a career?
Okay. The first question about private museums. So actually, it's the other way around. We choose not to work in private museums generally as a discipline. Now, I can't speak for all paleontologists, but I think that I can probably speak for me and certainly the Royal Tyrrell crew who are here right now, when I say that we probably, we try to make our science replicatable. Repeatable is a better word, isn't it? And we try to make it repeatable. And that means that we want people to be able to go back and test the observations that we've made on specimens. And so I have a Stegosaur specimen in the Natural History Museum in my collection that Richard Owen, who invented the Dinosauria, wrote a paper on in 1875. And he has his measurements in it, but they're all in inches and lines. I don't know what an inch and a line is. So I can go back to that specimen and I can check his observations. I can take his drawings and stand next to that specimen and go, oh, look, he was wrong or he was right. If it's in a private museum, the problem is that there's no certainty about what is going to happen to that fossil in the long term. And there have been cases where people have described fossils in the literature and then they've disappeared. And we don't know what's happened to them. We don't know anything more than what the original publication said. They can be sold, they can be auctioned, they can be destroyed, and we just don't know. So we, as a discipline, or some of us at least, make a decision that we don't publish on specimens unless they're held in collections which can store them in perpetuity. So that's the first question. The second question was about women in paleontology. It's a very, very good question. I wish that I had some really positive news about this. It is very male dominated, and it's interesting because when I was a PhD student, I reckoned that there, certainly in the sort of Mesozoic reptile world where I work, I guess, there were more women than men at that level, at the PhD level. And as I've got kind of further on, what I found is that the men who were around at that time are still around, and now they're in very senior professorial positions, and the women that were around then are no longer around in the discipline and have left. And it's really, really sad, and I don't know what the answer is, and I don't know that we are addressing it particularly well as a discipline. So I think it needs work, and yeah, I don't know how to answer any more than that, really.
No, it's a hard one to answer, so that's fair. I'm going to average a couple. People are kind of asking the same type of question different ways. So there's people asking about what would have been the main predators of Stegosaurs, and also have there been any tests about whether those tails, spines, would have been effective as anti-predator defenses?
Yeah. Okay. Good questions. So in a lot of the formations that stegosaurs have. We have things like the allosauroid theropods, so these big major top apex predators with these bone crushing bites. So something like Allosaurus or closely related organisms in other ecosystems outside of the Morrison formation would probably have been the main things attacking Stegosaurus. With regard to the tail spikes, yes, there have been. There's been a number of studies that have looked at the force with which the tail spike could have swung and the impact that it could have had. And what they have suggested is that actually stegosaurs could have swiped their tail and the impact at the end of the spine could have penetrated bone. Now, there's also a fossil that may or may not show, it has been described as showing this, and it's really, again, really difficult to test, but it's a vertebra, and the vertebra has, obviously, it's got a pathology, so it was wounded at some point, and the bone is healed around it, and what that pathology is it's a hole, and you can fit a stegosaur spike exactly into that hole. So it has been described as suggesting that this is actually, it's an Allosaurus vertebra. So it was actually a pathology on an Allosaurus vertebra, suggesting that it had been spiked by a stegosaur. It's a bit difficult to be definitive about that because there are other ways in which that sort of structure could have grown. But it's interesting. So yeah, I mean, it seems like stegosaurs could do some damage with the spikes at the end of their tails.
Okay. Ryan asks, have the brain cavities been scanned and described? And if so, what was the relative size of the brain? What does this mean about what senses they would have had? Yeah,
good question. So actually, that is work which we is still for us. We want to do with Sophie's skull, and we've got the brain case scans. Haven't actually finished the work yet though. But yeah, however, the skulls, before we could CT scan, people used to, in the olden days, they used to slice up the skulls and make endocasts, like rubber endocasts, to be able to examine the shapes of the brains. And that has been done for, there's an African stegosaur called Kentrosaurus, and that was done quite a bit for that. It was done a long time ago though, so they didn't do a great deal of kind of comparative work looking at what that meant for senses. But what is very clear is that stegosaurs had abnormally, or I don't know whether abnormally, very, very, very small brains given their body size. I think overall, there isn't a direct relationship between brain size and intelligence, but I don't think that they were winning, I don't think they were doing tons of crosswords and Sudokus and stuff like that. I don't think they were the brightest dinosaurs out there.
Okay. Does the demise of Stegosaurs and the rise of Ankylosaurs correspond with the increase in angiosperms in vegetation? Do you think that might be a factor, or is that not correlated?
Yeah, it could be. So angiosperms, we think, probably evolved towards the end of the Jurassic or possibly the early Cretaceous. I think the latest Jurassic angiosperms have been described, or at least putative ones. So it's possible. Now, people have actually examined correlations between different dinosaur taxa and different types of plants to look at this idea of dinosaur plant coevolution. And the results are largely inconclusive, actually. There's not a lot of good, there's no real statistically significant correlations that come out of that. So we don't see good correlations between ankylosaurs and angiosperms, or particular types or particular groups of angiosperms or things like that. That could be due to lack of data rather than anything else particularly, I think. So it's a little bit difficult to say, but yeah, I think that there were probably, it would appear at least that there was some sort of faunal turnover that occurred at the end of the Jurassic period. And it's a bit difficult because it's probably an impression that's heavily biased by the North American fossil record. It has been suggested that there was a mass extinction at the end of the Jurassic. And when we go into the Cretaceous, we're actually seeing quite different animals. And we certainly see that in the Ornithischian dinosaur faunas. As we go into the Cretaceous, suddenly, ankylosaurs become much more prevalent. We start to see things like iguanodontids, which we hadn't, again, well, they are there in the Jurassic, but they're they're not. You don't feel like they're dominating stuff. There's loads more of them. The hadrosauroids kind of take off. So yeah, so there seems to be some sort of big faunal turnover event, and it's possible it could be to do with the evolution of plants. It could be something else.
Okay. Anne asks, birds are not descended from the bird hip dinosaurs. So does this mean that birds separately evolved bird hips from the bird hip dinosaurs?
Yeah, that's exactly what it means. Yeah, the bird hip dinosaurs are called the bird hip dinosaurs because they have hips similar to birds. And yeah, they were convergently evolved, but potentially for different reasons. Now, what happens with the hips in dinosaurs is that you have a bone at the top of the hip called the ilium, and then you have one at the bottom called the ischium, and another one called the pubis. And in your lizards and alligators and crocs and all that sort of thing, the pubis points forward and the ischium points backwards. And then what happens in the ornithischians and in the birds is the pubis rotates to lie underneath the ischium. And this happens in both groups independently. Now, for birds, this is probably related to a change in their center of mass as they change their posture. So as the meat-eating dinosaurs evolved into birds, they have a more crouched limb posture, so their femur becomes much more horizontally angled, their tail becomes much shorter. And that making that tail much shorter kind of must have changed the whole way that their hip operated. And potentially that retroversion of the pubis is related to that. In ornithischian dinosaurs, we don't know why they have that. It has been suggested that this was to do with making room for a really long gut. So these are mega herbivores. They need a big, big gut to digest all of the vegetation. And it's possible that in order to have that really big kind of massive gut, the pubis retroverted. But actually, I don't think we know the answer to that question.
Okay. We have a question about when I was a child in the 50s, I made models of stegosaurs that appeared very similar to the ones that you show. So does this mean that paleontologists were able to develop reasonably good models from these very incomplete stegosaur specimens?
Yeah, I mean, I think they were. We had good ideas about what stegosaurs look like. We know that they have a tail, and we know they have spikes on their back, and we know they have 4 legs, and we have some good ideas about the proportions of those legs. And of course, there have been museum mounts around for a long time. Quite often they're composites of different specimens. So I think we knew the broad bow plan. I would say that the bow plan was never really in doubt. The exact details of that plan, like how long was that tail exactly, we didn't have a good idea about.
Okay, 2 final questions if you're still got some energy to finish this off. The question is, how do we know, what are the clues about the indication of the plates being alternating on Stegosaurus versus the other taxa you showed?
Because that's how they're found. So there's actually been, I think, 2 or 3 specimens in which the plates have been found kind of in situ on the back. And Sophie was one of these. So we have, although it was not excavated by us, we have lovely quarry maps. The people who excavated a beautiful job, beautiful quarry maps, and the plates are actually in situ along the back, and they're offset from each other. And so it has been thought for quite a long time the plates were offset from each other in Stegosaurus. Whereas with other stegosaurs, it's been less clear, but certainly, there's quite a bit of evidence to suggest, the plates actually are pairs. They look like pairs. Each one's slightly different, but they're the same size and the same shape. So it does look like they were paired in other specimens. Okay,
and the final, or not the final question, but the last one we'll ask, because there's just so many. Was what do we know about stegosaur trackways? Do we have a good fossil record?
Yeah, we do actually. The fossil record. I mean, tracks are always difficult because you're never quite sure who made them unless you find the animal dead at the end of the trackway. But we have tracks that we think are probably made by stegosaurs or their close relatives, right the way through from the Middle Jurassic into the Lower Cretaceous. So it's quite a good fossil record of trackways. They're known. They don't add tons to the body fossil record. I think there's a few occurrences that suggest stegosaurs in places where we haven't found their body fossils already. They kind of, I certainly use them to look at when I was looking at locomotion, to kind of think about whether the way that the trackways are made are supportive of what I was suggesting. One of the things that we tend to find with them is we don't have loads of really good trackways. Like we have tracks, but we don't have like a really long trackway, where we can see like an adult and a juvenile wandering along a beach together or something like that, which, sometimes we do have in sauropods and things. So they're not giving us perhaps the insight that we might hope for in terms of behavior that we do find in some other dinosaurs. But yeah, we have some tracks.
Okay, great. Well, thank you very much for answering all of those questions. Thank you to those who asked questions. Yeah, this is, I think, by far the most questions we've ever had. So that's great. Before we end, I just want to remind everyone that next week again is Dr. Michelle Stoker from Virginia Polytechnic Institute and State University presenting on life after death, evolutionary experimentation in the aftermath of the Permo-Triassic mass extinction. Thank you very much.